The wind off the steppe smelled like ash. It was the winter of 1221, somewhere on the frozen plains east of the Caspian Sea, and a small tribe of nomadic Turks was running for their lives. They had no castle walls to retreat behind. They had no great army to call upon. They had their horses, their tents, their children wrapped in wool against the killing cold, and the faint hope that if they rode hard enough, far enough, and long enough toward the setting sun, they might outpace the darkness rolling toward them from the east. Behind them, entire cities were disappearing from the map. Merv, one of the greatest metropolises in the medieval world, had just been erased. Nishapur, Balkh, Samarkand. These were not just cities. They were the living centres of Islamic civilization, places where scholars had catalogued the stars, where mathematicians had invented algebra, where poets had written verses that would outlast empires. They were burning now. Their populations, scholars, merchants, farmers, children, were dead. Hundreds of thousands of them. The force responsible moved across the earth like a dark tide pulling everything under water. The Mongol armies of Genghis Khan did not simply conquer, they unmade, they deleted. They swept through the most powerful civilizations on earth and left silence where there had been music, rubble where there had been towers, bone-white fields where there had been harvests. City-ears that had stood for 1,000 years ceased to exist between one sunrise and the next. Libraries that had taken generations to fill became ash in an afternoon. The world the Mongols left behind was quieter, emptier, and fundamentally altered in ways that would not be fully understood for centuries. This small tribe, a few hundred families of Oghuz Turks, part of a clan called the Kai, was fleeing that silence. Their chieftain was a man named Suleiman Shah, and he understood something that many kings in their palaces had failed to understand until it was too late. The Mongols could not be defeated, only escaped. So he led his people west, into the unknown, away from everything they had ever known, away from the graves of their ancestors and the pastures where their grandparents had grazed their herds, and the particular quality of light on the eastern steppe that marked the place as home. None of that could be carried. Only the people, only the horses, only the skill and the memory and the faith that had kept them alive so far. He could not have known, no one could have known, that this desperate flight through the snow would set in motion a chain of events stretching across 2 centuries, a chain that would culminate in the birth of one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. The tribe Suleiman Shah was leading westward was the ancestor of the Ottoman dynasty. His grandson, a boy named Osman, would be born on the exact day that the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, the cultural capital of the Islamic world. And from that catastrophe, from that rubble, from that ocean of grief and displaced peoples and shattered kingdoms, Osman would build something the Mongols never imagined. An empire designed not just to conquer, but to endure. An empire that would survive 6 centuries, outlasting the Mongols themselves by 400 years, spreading from the walls of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. This is the story of how the greatest act of destruction in medieval history became the unlikely birthplace of one of history's greatest empires. This is the story of how the Mongols, in trying to erase civilization, accidentally created one. This is the story of how the Ottoman Empire was born from fire. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed. In the year 1200, the Islamic world was at the height of its golden age. Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, was arguably the most sophisticated city on earth. 1 million people lived within its circular walls, a number that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. The city's great house of wisdom was not merely a library, but a living institution, a place where scholars translated ancient Greek texts into Arabic, where astronomers calculated the movements of planets with instruments of breathtaking precision, where physicians wrote medical encyclopedias that European universities would still be teaching from 500 years later. Baghdad was the intellectual center of the world. Its bazaars traded in silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa, and ideas from everywhere. And Baghdad was not alone. To the northwest, in the high plateaus of Anatolia, the peninsula we now call Turkey, the Sultanate of Rum had built a sophisticated Turkish state centered on the elegant city of Konya. The Seljuk sultans who ruled Rum were not barbarian warlords. They were patrons of architecture, sponsors of the mystical poet Rumi, administrators of a complex society of Turks, Armenians, Greeks and Arabs living in uneasy but mostly functional coexistence. Their realm stretched across central Anatolia, protecting a long frontier against the battered remnant of the Byzantine Empire to the west. That Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, guardian of Constantinople, had seen better centuries. The catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204 had shattered it almost beyond recognition. Crusaders from Western Europe, who were supposed to be fighting Muslims in the Holy Land, had instead sacked Constantinople itself, looting its churches, massacring its citizens, and establishing a clumsy Latin empire in its place. The real Byzantine successors had retreated to Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, waiting and plotting to reclaim their city. The whole western edge of Anatolia was a patchwork of competing claims, Greek and Turkish and Crusader, with no single power strong enough to impose order. This was the world in balance. Not a peaceful world, the medieval world was never peaceful, but a world of recognizable structures, kingdoms and sultanates and caliphates, each with their borders and their traditions and their calculations of power. A world where a skilled diplomat could negotiate, where a defeated army could surrender and expect mercy, where scholars could travel between courts and be welcomed for their knowledge. Then Genghis Khan rode out of Mongolia. You have to understand what the Mongols were in order to understand the terror they inspired. They were not simply a powerful army. They were something new under the sun. A military system so perfectly adapted to conquest that no existing civilization had developed any defense against it. Their horses were smaller and hardier than the war horses of the Islamic world or the armoured destriers of European knights. Each Mongol warrior rode with 3 or 4 spare horses, allowing him to cover distances that seemed physically impossible. An army that should have taken weeks to arrive appeared in days. A city that thought itself safe behind 100 miles of desert woke up to find Mongol siege engines outside its walls. Their tactics were works of terrifying genius. The feigned retreat, a maneuver so counterintuitive that trained soldiers refused to believe it was a trap, even when they had been warned, would draw pursuing cavalry out of defensive positions and into encirclement from 3 sides. Their composite bows, built from layers of bone and sinew and wood, could punch through armour at ranges that left their enemies unable to respond. Their intelligence network, built on a foundation of spies and scouts and systematic interrogation of prisoners, meant they often knew more about a city's internal politics than the city's own rulers. But the truly devastating innovation was psychological. The Mongols understood something that modern military planners would not formally articulate for centuries: that an enemy who surrenders without fighting costs you nothing, while an enemy who fights costs you soldiers and time. So they developed a deliberate, calculated policy of annihilation aimed specifically at cities that resisted. If you opened your gates and submitted, you would be taxed and incorporated into the empire. Your people would live. Your markets would reopen. But if you resisted, if a single arrow was fired from your walls, there would be no mercy, no surrender accepted, no quarter given. The population would be killed. Every building demolished. The very irrigation canals that made agriculture possible would be destroyed, so the land itself could not support life for generations. The cities of Central Asia had been some of the most densely populated urban centers on Earth. After the Mongols passed through them, travelers reported riding for days through rubble without encountering a living person. The historian Ibn Athir, who witnessed the early conquests, wrote that he wished he had not been born to see them. He described the devastation as something beyond the capacity of human language to convey, a catastrophe without precedent, without parallel, without any frame of reference in all of human history. This was the force advancing toward Anatolia, and in its path, hundreds of thousands of people were doing exactly what Suleiman Shah and the Kai tribe had done. They were running. The roads west were clogged with refugees, scholars carrying their books, merchants abandoning their goods, soldiers without commanders, families without homes, all of them flooding into Anatolia, bringing with them their skills, their knowledge, their grief, and their desperate hunger for somewhere safe to stop running. They brought with them, too, a kind of knowledge that no peaceful era ever produces: the intimate, bone-deep understanding of what a civilization looks like when it is ending. The survivors of Merv and Nishapur and Samarkand knew things about resilience and loss and the necessity of beginning again that no courtier in a stable kingdom could possibly understand. They were terrible things to know, but they would prove useful. This flood of displaced humanity would prove to be one of the most consequential demographic events of the medieval period. But in 1220, no one knew that. They were just running. Far to the west of all this chaos, in the mountain valleys and high plateaus of central Anatolia, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum was watching the reports come in with a mixture of alarm and, if we are honest, some degree of denial. Sultan Kaykhusrau II was not a fool. He understood that the Mongols were dangerous. He had received their envoys. He had listened to the refugees. But he had also built a powerful alliance: Armenian cavalry from Cilicia, archers from the Black Sea state of Trebizond, Frankish mercenaries with their heavy European armour, even a contingent from the Ayyubid Sultan at Aleppo. He commanded the largest coalition force the region had assembled in decades. When the Mongol general Baiju sent his ultimatum, submit personally, send hostages, accept a Mongol administrator in your capital, Kaykhusrau did something that sealed his kingdom's fate. He refused. His courtiers spit on the Mongol envoy. They sent him back to Baiju with insults. Baiju received this news sitting in his tent, eating dried meat, saying nothing. He had heard such defiance before. He knew exactly what came next. He began marching his army west toward the mountains of central Anatolia, toward a valley called Kursadar, the mountain of the bald man, where the fate of everything that came after would be decided in a single morning. Among the forces gathered on the Seljuk side of that valley were men from the Kai tribe, now led by Ertuğrul, son of Suleiman Shah. Ertuğrul had pledged his fighters to the Sultan of Rum in exchange for a small grant of land near the Byzantine frontier, a patch of high pasture and winter lowland in the northwest of Anatolia, a place called Söğüt. He was a frontier lord, a border guardian, a man of no great importance in the grand scheme of Seljuk politics. His tribe numbered perhaps 2,000 people. His warriors were capable, but few. He stood in the Seljuk lines that June morning of 1243 and watched the horizon to the east. He had been fleeing the Mongols his entire life. He was about to stop running and try to fight them. It would not go as planned. The valley of Kursadağ sits in the heart of Anatolia, in the rolling plateau country where the central mountains begin their long descent toward the Black Sea. In summer, the landscape is deceptively gentle. Golden grasslands, scattered groves of poplar, the occasional stone village clinging to a hillside. The valley itself is broad enough to maneuver in, but flanked on both sides by ridgelines that offer commanding views of anyone approaching from the east. Kaikhosrau's generals had chosen this ground deliberately. The eastern approaches were open enough to see the Mongols coming, but the valley's sides would, in theory, prevent the kind of wide flanking maneuvers that the Mongols preferred. The high ground behind the Seljuk lines offered a fallback position. The road to Sivas and its supplies ran to their rear. On paper, it was sound defensive thinking, but the word defensive contained within it the seeds of the problem. The Seljuk strategy was fundamentally reactive. They were waiting for the Mongols to come to them, planning to absorb the initial shock and then counterattack from a position of strength. This assumed that the Mongols would oblige them by attacking in a predictable fashion. It assumed that the Mongols would behave like the armies the Seljuks had faced before: Byzantine cavalry, Crusader knights, rival Turkic clans, all of whom fought according to conventions that could be anticipated and countered. The Mongols had no conventions. Kaikhosrau's coalition had gathered over the preceding weeks, the different contingents arriving by different roads and taking up their assigned positions. The Armenian cavalry from Cilicia occupied the left flank. Good riders, experienced fighters, motivated by the Mongols' prior devastation of their homeland. On the right, the archers from Trebizond took up positions on the lower ridgeline, their composite bows capable of laying down a devastating volume of fire at close range. In the centre, the Seljuk heavy cavalry formed the backbone of the line, armoured in lamella plate and chain, their lances and curved swords gleaming in the summer light. Scattered through the infantry formations were the Frankish mercenaries, men in the full heavy armour of European knights, nearly impervious to arrows, the armoured tanks of the medieval world. It was an impressive force. The chroniclers who wrote about it afterward, trying to explain the magnitude of what happened, estimated it as larger than the Mongol army opposing it. That much, at least, was almost certainly true. The Mongol force under Baiju had marched to Kursadağ from the northeast, moving at the pace that made the Mongols so terrifying. Each rider switching between horses, never allowing any single animal to tire, covering ground that should have taken weeks in days. They arrived at the eastern end of the valley in the last week of June 1243. And Baiju did something that the Seljuk commanders watching from their positions found puzzling. He stopped. He made camp. He did not attack. He was looking at the ground. Baiju had been fighting for the Mongol Empire for decades. He had watched cities fall and kingdoms crumble, and armies larger than this one disintegrate under the application of the right pressure at the right moment. He did not hurry. Hurry was for frightened men, and Baiju was not frightened. He was calculating. He rode along the eastern edge of the valley with a small escort, studying the terrain, noting the positions of the Seljuk units, observing the behavior of their pickets and outriders. He was looking for the line, the angle, the moment. His army, though smaller in total numbers than the Seljuk coalition, was composed almost entirely of cavalry, light horse archers who could cover 30 miles in a morning without tiring, supported by a smaller contingent of heavier armoured riders who would follow up once the archers had broken an enemy's formation. There were no infantry in Baiju's force, no siege equipment because no siege was anticipated, no supply wagons because each warrior carried his own dried meat and dried curd, and rode with the self-sufficiency of a man who expected to live off whatever the land and the enemy provided. This was not an army that needed supply lines. It was an organism that could exist indefinitely in motion, feeding on its enemy's resources. Impossible to pin down. Impossible to outlast. The Seljuk force, rich in heavy cavalry and armoured infantry, was built to hold ground. Baiju's force was built to make holding ground impossible. He found his angle in the open ground just north of the valley's eastern entrance, a wide depression in the plateau that would give his cavalry room to execute the maneuver he had in mind. The feigned retreat, the tulugma, the trap that had worked every time in every country against every army. All it required was that the enemy be hungry enough for victory to stop thinking clearly when they saw the Mongols turn and run. Human nature had never disappointed Baiju before. On the Seljuk side of the valley, the evening before the battle was a study in contrasts. In the Sultan's great tent, torches burned late into the night as commanders argued over the placement of reserves and the signal for the counterattack. Khosrow moved among his generals with the restless energy of a man who needed to believe, against the evidence of every report from the east, that this was a battle he could win. He had more men. He had better armour. He had the high ground. He listed these advantages to himself and to his commanders like a man counting coins in a hand that was already shaking. His Armenian commanders were confident. His Trebizond allies were terse but professional. The Frankish mercenaries, veterans of crusading campaigns from Constantinople to Jerusalem, said little and sharpened their weapons, which is what professional soldiers do when they have nothing useful to add to a council of war. Outside, in the long lines of campfires that stretched across the valley floor, the soldiers did what soldiers have always done the night before battle. They sharpened their weapons, the stone ringing on iron in the darkness, a sound both mundane and terrible in its implications. They prayed. The murmur of Arabic prayers drifted through the summer night air. Bismillah-ir-Rahman-ir-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Words spoken by men who were trying to remember that their lives belonged to something larger than their fear. Somewhere in those lines, a Seljuk infantryman from Konya sat with his back against his rolled blanket and thought about his wife. He was perhaps 22 years old. He had a small farm outside the city and a son he had last seen at the age of 3. He had not chosen this war. He had been called up with the levy, given a spear and a round shield, and marched east with 1,000 other men who had not chosen it either. He sat in the dark and turned a small bronze disc over and over in his fingers. A lucky piece his wife had pressed into his hand when he left. He did not know if he believed in luck. He prayed anyway. The prayer was the same one his father had taught him, the same one his grandfather had known, a thread of continuity that stretched back through all the generations of ordinary men who had sat in the dark before violent dawns and reached for something steady to hold on to. Among the Kai tribesmen, positioned toward the rear of the Seljuk formation, The preparations were different. These were not conscripted farmers. They were nomadic warriors for whom fighting was not a civic obligation, but a way of life, a craft practiced and refined across generations. Ertugrul moved among his men in the firelight, not speaking much. He was not, from the surviving accounts, a man of many words, but checking on equipment, adjusting a saddle girth here, examining an arrowhead there. His presence was the reassurance itself. His fighters cleaned and restrung their composite bows, the delicate process of maintaining the tension and flexibility of laminated wood and bone that gave the weapon its range and power. They checked the fletching on their arrows, discarding any that had warped. They inspected their horses, the real foundation of nomadic military power. The animals were smaller than the great war horses of the Seljuk heavy cavalry, but tougher, faster over distance, able to be ridden hard for hours on nothing but dried meat and a handful of grain. The Mongols, a mile to the east, made almost no noise at all. This was itself a kind of psychological weapon. The Seljuk pickets, straining to hear from their positions on the forward ridgelines, reported back that the Mongol camp was unnervingly quiet. No singing, no drums, only the sound of horses and occasionally a brief, sharp command in a language none of them understood. The silence felt predatory. It felt like a great animal breathing in the dark, waiting with perfect patience for daylight and the moment to spring. Beiju did not sleep that night. He sat at the entrance of his tent and watched the stars turn overhead, and he thought about nothing at all. He had done this before. The plan was set. The men knew their positions. When the sun rose, everything would proceed as it always had. He was right. The sun came up over the eastern ridgeline and turned the valley gold. For a moment, a single suspended moment before the world changed, it was beautiful. The dew on the summer grass caught the early light and shimmered. The mountains to the north were a deep purple blue against the brightening sky. A lark was singing somewhere on the hillside, utterly indifferent to the 20,000 men arrayed below it. Then the drums started. Not the war drums of the Seljuks, the great kettle drums that would signal a charge, the trumpets that would announce formations. These were Mongol drums, a different sound entirely. Lower, slower. Not a beat to march to, but a pulse, a rhythmic pressure that seemed to come from inside the chest rather than outside the ears. The men on the Seljuk lines heard it before they could see anything, and the sound worked on them exactly as it was intended to. It bypassed reason and spoke directly to something older and more primal, the part of the animal brain that recognizes a predator in the darkness. Then the Mongol cavalry appeared. They came out of the morning light like ghosts, resolving into form. Thousands of riders moving at a steady trot across the eastern plateau. Their horses small and dark and numerous. Their riders bent low, faces wrapped against the dust their own movement was already beginning to raise. They did not shout. They did not wave their weapons in the theatrical displays of courage that medieval armies typically exchanged before battle. They simply came, quiet and relentless, spreading laterally as they approached to fill the width of the valley entrance. The Seljuk commanders on the forward ridgelines were looking at something they had heard described by refugees for years, but never personally witnessed. The reports had not done it justice. The Frankish mercenaries in the Seljuk centre, men who had fought in the Crusades and faced every kind of medieval army, steadied their horses and gripped their lances. They were the most heavily armoured soldiers on the field, clad head to foot in mail and plate, nearly invulnerable to the arrows. They could already see the Mongols knocking to their composite bows. Their job was to hold the center. They were very good at their job. The first Mongol volley came from 300 yards, far beyond the range at which a conventional archer could expect accuracy. But Mongol composite bows, drawn with 90 or 100 pounds of force, could throw a war arrow that distance with enough energy to punch through lamellar armor. The shafts fell into the Seljuk formation like slanted rain, and men and horses began to die. But the Franks held. Their armor absorbed what the Seljuk infantries could not. The Armenian cavalry on the left flank returned fire, their own archers skilled enough to force the Mongols to keep moving. For the first 15 minutes of the battle, the exchange was almost even. The Mongols probing, the Seljuks responding, neither side breaking, neither side gaining decisive advantage. Kai Khusraw, watching from a rise behind the main line, felt something ease in his chest. They were holding. The Mongols were dangerous, yes, the casualties were already mounting in the forward infantry, but they were not invincible. The line was holding. But he was watching the wrong thing. The Mongol attack was not a simple frontal assault. It never was. While the forward cavalry engaged the Seljuk center with arrow volleys and probing charges, Beiju had sent 2 flanking columns wide around both sides of the valley before dawn, using the darkness and the terrain to conceal their movement. These columns had spent the night hours climbing the ridgelines above the valley, positioning themselves on the high ground that the Seljuks had assumed was their own fallback position. By mid-morning, those columns were in place, invisible, waiting. Then Beiju gave the signal. The Mongol cavalry in the valley floor, the entire visible Mongol force, turned and ran. They turned their horses east and galloped, raising a great cloud of dust, the drumming of their hooves diminishing as they pulled away from the Seljuk lines. From the Seljuk perspective, it looked like a rout. It looked like a victory. The Mongols were broken. They were fleeing. The day was won. Kai Khusraw's generals did not advise caution. They had heard about the feigned retreat. Every commander in the Islamic world had heard about it. But hearing about a trap and recognizing it in the moment of apparent triumph are 2 entirely different things. The Sultan's cavalry commanders were men whose culture defined courage as forward motion, who understood battlefield honor as the pursuit of a breaking enemy. And the Mongols were breaking. They were running. "Forward!" the order passed down the line. The Seljuk cavalry poured out of their defensive positions and surged east across the valley floor, pushing through the gap where the Mongol lines had been, pursuing the fleeing riders into the open plateau beyond the valley's eastern mouth. They were out of the valley now, out of the high ground, out of their defensive positions. Spread across the open plateau in pursuit formation, strung out across miles of flat ground, exactly where Beiju needed them to be. The Mongol flanking columns came down off the ridgelines like an avalanche. From the north and south simultaneously, thousands of riders poured down the hillsides, cutting across the plateau to seal off the Seljuk cavalry's retreat back to the valley. The pursuing Seljuks turned and saw, to their left and their right, walls of Mongol horsemen closing like the jaws of a trap snapping shut. The fleeing Mongol cavalry at the front wheeled their horses and came back. In the space of 2 minutes, the Seljuk advance guard went from pursuers to the pursued. The killing began. Mongol archers on horseback, riding at full gallop, firing backward over their shoulders with the accuracy that came from a lifetime of practice, sent volley after volley into the packed Seljuk formation. Men who had ridden out confidently 5 minutes ago now found themselves penned in from 3 sides, unable to retreat, unable to advance, dying in place. The horses, terrified by the noise and the smell of blood, added their own chaos to the slaughter, rearing and colliding, throwing riders, trampling the wounded. In the valley behind, the infantry units left behind began to understand what was happening. But it was happening too fast, far too fast. Ertuğrul and the Kayi warriors, positioned further back in the Seljuk formation, did not join the initial pursuit. Something in the way the Mongols had broken did not sit right with a man who had spent his life running from them. He held his riders back. He watched the pursuing Seljuk cavalry disappear east over the plateau's lip. He heard the sound that followed, the roar of thousands of new riders appearing from nowhere, the shift in the battle noise from triumphant to desperate. He sat on his horse in the valley and understood. By noon, the battle had ceased to be a contest. The Seljuk cavalry, caught in the Mongol encirclement on the plateau, were being systematically destroyed. Those who broke through the encirclement and ran for the valley found it in chaos. Infantry units dissolving, commanders screaming orders that no one could hear or was willing to obey. The left flank, the Armenian cavalry, had seen the trap close on the centre and made their own calculation. They were riding north, away. The battle was lost, and they knew it before most of the Seljuk army did. And Armenian pragmatism outweighed Armenian loyalty when the numbers were this bad. The Trebizond archers on the right ridgeline held longer than anyone might have expected. They were high enough to see the whole battlefield, which meant they could see exactly how bad it was. And they kept shooting anyway, buying time, covering the retreat of whatever infantry could reach the hillside below them. But Mongol flanking riders were already climbing toward them, and eventually even the most stubborn archer runs out of arrows and options. In the centre of the Seljuk main line, the Frankish mercenaries were still fighting. These were men who had come from thousands of miles away, hired for money, with no particular loyalty to the Sultan of Rum, or his empire, or his god. They should have been the first to flee. But they were professional soldiers, and professional soldiers fight. They had formed up in a tight defensive square, their heavy armour largely proof against Mongol arrows, their lances and swords exacting a real cost from any rider who came close enough to be reached. The Mongols did not close with them. They circled at range, sending arrows into the gaps in the armour, the eye slits, the places where chain met plate and the coverage was imperfect. It was slow work. Grinding work, patient work. It was working. Around them, everything else was dissolving. The Seljuk infantry ran south, east, north, any direction that was not toward the Mongols. Abandoned equipment littered the valley floor. Standards were down. Officers who had survived the cavalry's encirclement were trying to rally men who had stopped listening to officers. A tribune shouted at a group of fleeing infantry and was ignored. He grabbed one man by the arm and the man shook him off and kept running. Not with any particular urgency, just steadily. The way a man walks away from something that no longer has any claim on him. That was what defeat looked like from the inside. Not a dramatic moment, just men deciding one by one that the contract was broken. Kaikhosro watched from his position on the rear rise and faced a choice that no amount of battlefield courage could solve for him. His army was breaking. His cavalry was dead or scattered. His centre was a tightening noose with the Franks in the middle. In an hour, maybe less, the Mongols would complete their sweep and come for him. He could stay and die. He could buy time for his remaining infantry with the sacrifice of his own life, and perhaps there was something in his culture that argued for that choice. He could ride into the Mongols himself, sword drawn, meeting the end that warriors were supposed to meet. He rode south. Later, history would judge him for it. History would be correct to judge him. But in the moment, it was simply a man choosing to live, the most human choice there is, made by the wrong man at the worst possible time. The word passed through the Seljuk lines the way catastrophic news always does, faster than it should be possible, through some channel that bypasses language and goes directly to the gut. The Sultan is leaving. The Sultan is gone. The Sultan ran. When an army's centre of gravity disappears, what remains is not an army. It is a collection of individual men, each of whom is suddenly making individual calculations about survival. And those calculations almost uniformly conclude the same thing: run. The Seljuk line did not break. It evaporated. The Frankish mercenaries, still fighting their desperate defensive action in the centre, were now alone in a field of dead men and abandoned weapons. They looked around and saw nothing to their left or right but corpses and fleeing shapes in the distance, and, closing from every direction, Mongol horsemen who had completed the encirclement and were now mopping up what remained. The mercenaries made the only rational choice left to them. They surrendered. Baiju, receiving their capitulation from the back of his horse, took them prisoner without particular cruelty. They had fought well. There was nothing dishonouring about being conquered by the Mongols. It was practically the universal condition of the known world at this point. He would incorporate the survivors as he incorporated everything useful that fell into his hands. On the hillsides and the plateau and the roads south toward Konya, the pursuit began. The Mongols were merciless in pursuit, not out of bloodlust, but out of military logic. A fleeing enemy that escapes today becomes a rallying point tomorrow. The light cavalry fanned out across the countryside in groups of 20 and 30, running down the fugitives, cutting off the roads. The killing that happened in the hours after the battle proper ended was probably worse by raw numbers than the killing during the battle itself. Ertugrul and his K riders did not pursue. They had held back during the initial engagement, survived the collapse, and now sat in the valley while Seljuk soldiers fled around them and Mongol cavalry swept past them in pursuit. They were small enough to be ignored, experienced enough to project the calm of men who had already decided to be somewhere else, and practical enough to understand that the battle was over, and fighting it further would simply be death. He watched the Mongol riders going past him, so close he could see the dried rations in their saddlebags, the bone-handled knives at their belts, the complete indifference in their faces for anything that was not their assigned target. He sat very still. His men sat very still. The Mongols flowed around them like water around a stone. The following day, a delegation from the Seljuk capital arrived at Baiju's camp under a white flag. The messenger who carried the Sultan's terms for negotiation was a court vizier of considerable dignity, who had ridden hard through the night, arriving dust-covered and exhausted to present himself before the Mongol general. Baiju was eating when he arrived. He did not stand. He did not acknowledge the vizier's entrance for a full minute, continuing to eat with the focused attention of a man for whom this moment contained no drama at all. It was simply the expected conclusion to yesterday's work. The terms he offered were not punitive in the Mongol fashion, because Kai Khusraw had not actually been caught in the act of defiance at Kur Sardar. He had fled, which was not the same as fighting to the death. The Sultanate of Rum would remain. A Seljuk Sultan would continue to sit on the throne at Konya, but the tribute would be permanent and substantial. Gold, silk, camels, sheep, in quantities specified by the Mongol administration. A Mongol Daruhachi, an overseer, would be stationed at Ankara to ensure compliance. And the Sultan would come in person to the Mongol court and prostrate himself before the great Khan. The vizier accepted these terms. He had no other option. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum still existed on the map,
but its sovereignty was a fiction. The real power in Anatolia now resided with the Ilkhanate, the Mongol Khanate of Persia that administered the region through its military governor. The proud kingdom that had patronized Rumi and built the caravanserais that dotted the Anatolian roads, and held off the Byzantine Empire for 2 centuries, was now a tax collection mechanism for men who had never heard of Rumi and cared nothing for caravanserais. Ertugrul's men watched the Mongol cavalry camp being established at Ankara. They watched the Darughachi arrive with his staff and his soldiers. They watched the flow of tribute convoys heading east. And then, quietly, they rode back to their land at Sout, on the Byzantine frontier, as far from the Mongol centre of gravity as they could get, while still remaining in Seljuk territory. The valley of Kösedağ was quiet now. The birds had come back. A crow picked at something in the grass where the Frankish square had stood. The summer wind moved through the abandoned equipment. A torn standard, a broken lance, a child's bronze disc lying in the dust, its owner dead somewhere on the plateau. The Sultanate of Rum was dead. It would take another 60 years to finish dying, but its soul departed on this hillside in June of 1243. Into the space it left behind, something new was already beginning to grow. The Battle of Kösedağ was not a slaughter on the scale of the Mongols' greatest campaigns. The Seljuk coalition had not resisted to the point of total annihilation, and Baiju's terms were comparatively moderate. But the casualties were sufficient to destroy the Seljuk military as an effective force. Thousands of cavalry killed or captured on the plateau. Thousands more infantry cut down in the pursuit. The Armenian contingent from Cilicia, which had fled north, never really recovered its fighting strength. The mercenary Franks, most of whom survived captivity and were eventually ransomed, went home with stories that made the rounds of the courts of Europe and confirmed every rumour about the Mongols that had been circulating for 20 years. Kaikhosro II reached Konya and survived the immediate aftermath, but not by much. He died in 1246, less than 3 years after the battle that had destroyed his kingdom's independence, leaving behind 3 young sons, who immediately began competing for the throne. The Mongol administrators watched this succession crisis with professional interest and exploited it expertly, playing the sons against each other, demanding separate tribute payments, ensuring that no single Seljuk heir would ever again command the loyalty of the whole kingdom's military. The policy worked perfectly. The Sultanate of Rum spent the next 60 years killing itself in slow motion. Its final dissolution in 1307, not so much a dramatic end as a quiet stopping of a machine that had long since run out of anything to run on. The Mongol garrison at Ankara became a permanent feature of the Anatolian landscape. Ilkhanate Darughachis administered the central plateau, collecting tribute, settling disputes according to Mongol law, and maintaining the infrastructure of imperial domination with the cold efficiency that characterized Mongol provincial administration everywhere. The roads were safe, the caravanserais operational, the markets functioning. The Mongols were not interested in destroying their tax base, only in extracting its maximum value. But the sultans in Konya were shadows, and the proud tradition of Seljuk sovereignty was a memory that faded with each passing year. 15 years after Kösedağ, the Mongols completed what they had begun. In the winter of 1258, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brother of the great Khan, arrived outside the walls of Baghdad with what may have been the largest army the Mongol Empire had ever assembled. An estimated 150,000 soldiers,
supplemented by Chinese artillery specialists, Georgian cavalry, Armenian contingents, Persian auxiliaries. The Caliph al-Musta'sim, the last true commander of the Abbasid dynasty that had ruled the Islamic world's spiritual center for 500 years, had failed to provide Hulagu with the military support he had demanded. He had also failed to maintain the loyalty of his own commanders, some of whom were already in secret communication with the Mongols. The siege lasted 12 days. Mongol siege engines breached Baghdad's ancient walls in a matter of hours once they were properly deployed. The Caliph's army, whatever remained of it after the defections and the initial assaults, collapsed. On the 10th of February, 1258, al-Musta'sim surrendered the city. The massacre that followed was recorded by every major historian of the period, and they all struggled with the same problem. The numbers were too large to be meaningful. Hundreds of thousands dead. The great libraries emptied and burned. The House of Wisdom, repository of 5 centuries of accumulated human knowledge, razed. The irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, which had supported agriculture in the region since the Sumerians, systematically destroyed. The Tigris River ran dark with the ink of drowned books and red with blood for days afterward. Witnesses reported finding skulls piled in mountains at the city gates. The caliphate was dead. The institution that had provided the Islamic world with its spiritual and political center since 632 CE was gone. There would never be another caliph with anything like genuine authority until, and here the story bends back on itself, the Ottoman sultans of the 16th century claimed the title for themselves. The immediate refugee wave that followed the fall of Baghdad dwarfed anything Anatolia had previously absorbed. Scholars, physicians, mathematicians, poets, theologians, jurists, the entire intellectual class of the Islamic world's greatest city scattered in every direction, and a substantial portion of them headed northwest, toward the one corner of the former Islamic world that the Mongols had not yet directly administered. They came with their books and their expertise and their traumatized brilliance to the western edges of Anatolia, to the courts of the minor Turkish lords who were now effectively autonomous on the old Seljuk frontier. Among those frontier lords was Ertuğrul Bey of the Kai tribe, now aging and long established at Surt, whose small principality on the Byzantine border had been quietly attracting refugees and warriors and scholars for 20 years. Into this principality, far from the Mongol centre of gravity, the scattered intelligence of the Islamic world was slowly accumulating. His son, Osman, born in one of history's most pointed ironies on the very day Baghdad fell, was watching all of this. He was learning from it. He was thinking about what it meant. Stand on the site of the Battle of Köserdağ today, and you will find a landscape of startling tranquility. Wheat fields and grazing land stretch across the valley floor. The ridgelines are dotted with scattered trees. A few village roads cross the plateau where the Mongol cavalry made their encircling sweep. There is no monument, no museum, almost no sign that anything of consequence happened here, that the fate of 20 million people and the next 7 centuries of history turned on this ground one June morning. The birds still sing on the hillside where the Frankish square stood its last. Ertuğrul died around 1281, having spent 50 years building something quietly extraordinary. A frontier principality that had survived everything the most violent century in human history could throw at it. He had arrived in Anatolia as a refugee. He left his son an army, a territory, a network of loyalties, and a reputation for justice on the frontier that attracted the steady stream of warriors and scholars that any new state needs to become real. He had never been a great sultan, never commanded armies that shook the world, never appeared in the chronicles of distant capitals. He was a small man, operating in a small space, and he had done the most important thing a founder can do. He had kept the possibility alive. His son Osman was 23 years old when he inherited the tribe's leadership. Anatolia, by this point, was a broken landscape, its old order entirely dissolved. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The Mongol Ilkhanate administered the central plateau, but had no interest in or ability to control the far western frontier. The Byzantine Empire, still not fully recovered from 1204, was a shadow of itself. Wealthy and sophisticated in Constantinople, but incapable of projecting power into the interior. The power vacuum that the Mongols had created by destroying the Seljuks was still there, vast and empty, waiting. Osman walked into it. Around 1299, Osman formally declared independence from the remnant Seljuk political structure that had nominally claimed suzerainty over his beylik. It was less a dramatic act of rebellion than an acknowledgement of reality. There was nothing left to be subordinate to. He began minting his own coins, the definitive assertion of sovereignty in the medieval world. Coins that bore his name and the names of his Islamic faith. He began receiving the formal pledges of local lords, scholars and warriors who recognized in this compact, efficiently governed frontier state something they had not seen since the Mongols arrived: a future. The three gifts the Mongols had unknowingly given the Ottomans were now fully in evidence. First, the military manpower. The waves of Turkic warriors who had been driven west by Mongol pressure and had accumulated on the frontier. Men skilled in exactly the kind of mobile, aggressive fighting that border expansion required. Second, the administrative and intellectual talent, the scholars and jurists and bureaucrats who had fled Baghdad and the other destroyed cities, and were now available to give Osman's raw frontier principality the institutional sophistication of a real state. Third, the geography. The specific location in the one corner of Anatolia that the Mongols could not easily reach, pressed against a weakened Byzantine frontier where expansion was possible. From these raw materials, built on the rubble of everything the Mongols had destroyed, Osman and his successors constructed the Ottoman Empire. The irony deepens when you look at what came next. In 1402, a Turco-Mongol conqueror named Timur, who saw himself as the heir to Genghis Khan's legacy, struck the young Ottoman state with devastating force at the Battle of Ankara. He captured the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, humiliating the empire, triggering a decade of civil war. It seemed for a moment that the Mongols would finish what they had started, that the empire born from Mongol chaos would be destroyed by a Mongol heir. The old pattern seemed to be asserting itself. The storm from the east would erase everything. But Timur, in his campaign through Anatolia, had also destroyed every other Turkish beylik that might have competed with the Ottomans for dominance of the peninsula. When the Ottoman civil war ended, and Mehmed I reunified the state in 1413, he found himself the ruler of an Anatolia with no serious rivals. The very attack that had nearly killed the Ottomans had cleared the field for them. The Mongol heir had, once again, accidentally served the Ottoman cause. Within 40 years, Mehmed II stood at the walls of Constantinople. The city fell on May 29, 1453. 210 years after the Battle of Kurzedar, the empire that had been born from the wreckage of the Seljuks and the trauma of Baghdad, and the desperate ride of a small Turkic tribe through the winter snow of 1221, had completed what the entire Islamic world had dreamed of for 8 centuries. The last great Christian capital of the East was Ottoman. Genghis Khan had wanted to erase civilization and replace it with something simpler. He had largely succeeded in erasing what was there, but he had failed, as all such projects ultimately fail, to stop civilization from rebuilding itself in the spaces his destruction created. The refugees he drove west brought their knowledge and their faith and their fury and their grief to a frontier valley in Anatolia. And from all of it, they made something new, something that lasted, something that carried within it the memory of everything that had been lost. Empires are not built from strength. They are built from the determination of people who have nothing left to lose. Centuries later, in a small town called Sout in the province of Bilecik, the tomb of Ertuğrul Bey still stands. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, people come to pay their respects to the man who held his tribe together through the worst century in human history, and gave his son a place to stand when the time came to build something lasting. The tomb is modest. The man it honours was not, in his own time, considered important. The valley of Kurzadar, a few hundred miles east, grows wheat now, peaceful and golden in the summer sun, the ridge lines bare and unhurried, the plateau where Baiju's encirclement swept, closed, as empty and quiet as a finished thought. He only changed the world. The tribe that fled through the winter snow, that Genghis Khan never knew existed, that Baiju ignored when it sat still in the valley of Kurzadar, that history forgot for 2 centuries before it remembered, outlasted them all. They only wanted to live, and so they built an empire.